The Covered Wagon by Emerson Hough. Chapter 1. Youth Marches. Look at 'em come, Jesse! More and more. Must be 40 or 50 families. Molly Wingate, middle-aged, portly, dark-browed and strong, stood at the door of the rude tent, which for the time made her home. She was pointing down the road which lay like an ecru ribbon thrown down across the prairie grass, bordered beyond by the timber-grown bluffs of the Missouri. Jesse Wingate allowed his team of harness-marked horses to continue their eager drinking at the watering hole of the little stream near which the camp was pitched, until, their thirst quenched, they began burying their muzzles and blowing into the water in sensuous enjoyment. He stood, a strong and tall man of perhaps 45 years, of keen blue eye and short, close-matted, tawny beard. His garb was the loose dress of the outlying settler of the western lands 3/4 of a century ago. A farmer he must have been back home. Could this encampment, on the very front of the American civilization, now be called a home? Beyond the prairie road could be seen a double furrow of jet-black, glistening sod, framing the green grass and its spangling flowers, first browsing of the plow on virgin soil. It might have been the opening of a farm, but if so, why the crude bivouac? Why the gear of travelers? Why the massed arc-like wagons, the scores of morning fires lifting lazy blue wreaths of smoke against the morning mists? The truth was that Jesse Wingate, earlier and impatient on the front, out of the very suppression of energy, had been trying his plow in the first white furrows beyond the Missouri in the great year of 1848. 400 other nearby plows alike were avid for the soil of Oregon, as witness this long line of newcomers, late at the frontier rendezvous. "It's the Liberty wagons from downriver," said the campmaster at length. "Missouri movers and settlers from lower Illinois. It's time. We can't lie here much longer waiting for Missouri or Illinois either. The grass is up." "Well, we'd have to wait for Molly to end her spring term, teaching in Clay School in Liberty," rejoined his wife. "Else why'd we send her there to graduate? $12 a month, cash money, ain't to be sneezed at." "No. Nor is 2,000 miles of trail between here and Oregon, before snow, to be sneezed at either. If Molly ain't with those wagons, I'll send Jed over for her today. If I'm going to be captain, I can't hold the people here on the river any longer, with May already begun." "She'll be here today," asserted his wife. "She said she would. Besides, I think that's her riding a little one side the road now. Not that I know who all is with her. One young man, two. Well, with maternal pride. Molly ain't never lacked for beaux. But look at the wagons come," she added. "All the country's going west this spring, it certainly seems like." It was the spring gathering of the westbound wagon trains, stretching from Old Independence to Westport Landing, the spot where that very year the new name of Kansas City was heard among the emigrants as the place of the jump-off. It was now an hour by sun, as these western people would have said, and the low-lying valley mists had not yet fully risen, so that the atmosphere for a great picture did not lack. It was a great picture, a stirring panorama of an earlier day, which now unfolded. Slow, swaying, stately, the ox teams came on, as though impelled by and not compelling the fleet of white canvas sails. The teams did not hasten, did not abate their speed, but moved in an unagitated advance that gave the massed column something irresistibly epical in look. The train, foreshortened to the watchers at the rendezvous, had a well-spaced formation, 20 wagons, 30, 40, 47, as Jesse Wingate mentally counted them. There were outriders. There were clumps of driven cattle. Along the flanks walked tall men, who flung over the low-headed cattle an admonitory lash whose keen report presently could be heard, still faint and far off. A dull dust cloud arose, softening the outlines of the prairie ships. The broad gestures of arm and trunk, the monotonous soothing of commands to the sophisticated kine, as yet remained vague, so that still it was properly a picture done on a vast canvas, that of the frontier in '48, a picture of might, of inevitableness. Even the sober souls of these waiters rose to it, felt some thrill they themselves had never analyzed. A boy of 20, tall, blond, tousled, rode up from the grove back of the encampment of the Wingate family. "You, Jed," said his father, "ride on out and see if Molly's there." "Sure she is," commented the youth, finding a plug in the pocket of his jeans. That's her. 2 fellers, like usual. Sam Woodhull, of course, said the mother, still hand over eye. He hung around all winter, telling how him and Colonel Donovan whipped all Mexico and won the war. If Molly ain't in a wagon of her own, it ain't his fault anyways. I'll rest assured it's account of Molly's going out to Oregon that he's going too. Well, and again, well. Who's the other fellow, though? Demanded Jed. I can't place him this far. Jesse Wingate handed over his team to his son and stepped out into the open road, moved his hat in an impatient signal, half of welcome, half of command. It apparently was observed. To their surprise, it was the unidentified rider who now set spur to his horse and came on at a gallop ahead of the train. He rode carelessly well, a born horseman. In no more than a few minutes, he could be seen as rather a gallant figure of the border cavalier. A border just then more martial than it had been before '46, and the days of 54-40 or fight. A shrewd man might have guessed this young man, he was no more than 28, to have got some military air on a border opposite to that of Oregon. The far southwest, where Taylor and Scott and the less-known Donovan and many another fighting man had been adding certain thousands of leagues to the soil of this republic. He rode a compact, short-coupled, cat-hammed steed, coal-black and with a dashing forelock reaching almost to his red nostrils. A horse never reared on the fat Missouri cornlands. Neither did this heavy embossed saddle with its silver concho decorations then seem familiar so far north. Nor yet the thin braided leather bridle with its hair frontlet band and its mighty bit, nor again the great spurs with jingling rowel bells. This rider's mount and trappings spoke the far and new Southwest, just then coming into our national ken. The young man himself, however, was upon the face of his appearance nothing of the swashbuckler. True, in his close-cut leather trousers, his neat boots, his tidy gloves, his rather jaunty broad black hat of felted beaver, he made a somewhat raffish figure of a man as he rode up, weight on his underthigh, sidewise, and hand on his horse's quarters, carelessly. But his clean-cut, unsmiling features, his direct and grave look out of dark eyes, spoke him a gentleman of his day and place, and no mere spectacular pretender assuming a virtue, though he had it not. He swung easily out of saddle, his right hand on the tall, broad Spanish horn as easily as though rising from a chair at presence of a lady, and removed his beaver to this frontier woman before he accosted her husband. His bridle he flung down over his horse's head, which seemingly anchored the animal, spite of its loud whinnying challenge to these nearby stolid creatures, which showed harness rubs and not whitened saddle hairs. "Good morning, madam," said he in a pleasant, quiet voice. "Good morning, sir. You are Mr. and Mrs. Jesse Wingate, I believe. Your daughter yonder told me so." "That's my name," said Jesse Wingate, eyeing the newcomer suspiciously, but advancing with ungloved hand. "You're from the Liberty train?" "Yes, sir. My name is Banyan. William Banyan. You may not know me. My family were Kentuckians before my father came out to Franklin. I started up in the law at old Liberty town yonder not so long ago. But I've been away a great deal." "The law, eh?" Jesse Wingate again looked disapproval of the young man's rather pronouncedly neat turnout. "Then you're not going west?" "Oh yes, I am, if you please, sir. I've done little else all my life. 2 years ago I marched with all the others, with Donovan, for Mexico. Well, the war's over, and the treaty's likely signed. I thought it high time to march back home. But you know how it is, the long trail's in my blood now. I can't settle down." Wingate nodded. The young man smilingly went on. "I want to see how it is in Oregon. What with new titles and the like, and a lot of fighting men cast in together out yonder too. There ought to be as much law out there as here, don't you think? So I'm going to seek my fortune in the far west. It's too close and tame in here now. He smiled just a bit more obviously and deprecatingly. "I'm leading yonder cabalad of our neighbors, with a bunch of Illinois and Indiana wagons. They call me Colonel William Banyan. It is not right. I was no more than Will Banyan, Major under Donovan. I am not that now." A change, a shadow came over his face. He shook it off as though it were tangible. "So I'm at your service, sir. They tell me you've been elected captain of the Oregon train. I wanted to throw in with you if I might, sir. I know we're late. We should have been in last night. I rode in to explain that. May we pull in just beside you, on this water? Molly Wingate, on whom the distinguished address of the stranger, his easy manner, and his courtesy had not failed to leave their impression, answered before her husband. You certainly can, Major Banyan. Mr. Banyan, please. Well then, Mr. Banyan. The water and grass is free. The day's young. Drive in and light down. You said you saw our daughter, Molly. I know you did, for that's her now. The young man colored under his bronze of tan, suddenly shy. I did, said he. The fact is, I met her earlier this spring at Clay Seminary, where she taught. She told me you all were moving west this spring. Said this was her last day. She asked if she might ride out with our wagons to the rendezvous. Well, dash. That's a fine horse you got there, interrupted young Jed Wingate. Spanish? Yes, sir. Wild? Oh no, not now, only of rather good spirit. Ride him if you like. Gallop back if you'd like to try him, and tell my people to come on and park in here. I'd like a word or so with Mr. Wingate. With a certain difficulty, yet insistent, Jed swung into the deep saddle, sitting the restive, rearing horse well enough withal, and soon was off at a fast pace down the trail. They saw him pull up at the head of the caravan and motion, wide-armed, to the riders, the train not halting at all. He joined the two equestrian figures on ahead, the girl and the young man whom his mother had named as Sam Woodhull. They could see him shaking hands, then doing a curvet or so to show off his newly borrowed mount. He takes well to riding, your son, said the newcomer approvingly. He's been crazy to get west, assented the father. Wants to get among the buffalo. We all do, said Will Banyan. None left in Kentucky this generation back, none now in Missouri, the plains. His eye gleamed. That's Sam Woodhull along, resumed Molly Wingate. He was with Donovan. Yes. Banyan spoke so shortly that the good dame, owner of a sought-for daughter, looked at him keenly. He lived at Liberty, too. I've known Molly to write of him. Yes? Suddenly and with vigor. She knows him, then? Why, yes. So do I, said Banyan simply. He was in our regiment. Captain and adjutant, paymaster and quartermaster chief, too, sometimes. The Army regulations never meant much with Donovan's column. We did as we liked, and did the best we could, even with paymasters and quartermasters. He colored suddenly, and checked, sensitive to a possible charge of jealousy, before this keen-eyed mother of a girl whose beauty had been the talk of the settlement now for more than a year. The rumors of the charm of Molly Wingate, Little Molly, as her father always called her to distinguish her from her mother, now soon were to have actual and undeniable verification to the eye of any skeptic who mayhap had doubted mere rumors of a woman's beauty. The three advance figures, the girl Woodhull, her brother Jed, broke away and raced over the remaining few hundred yards, coming up abreast, laughing in the glee of youth exhilarated by the feel of good horseflesh under knee and the breath of a vital morning air. As they flung off, Will Banyan scarce gave a look to his own excited steed. He was first with a hand to Molly Wingate as she sprang lightly down, anticipating her other cavalier Woodhull, who frowned, none too well pleased, as he dismounted. Molly Wingate ran up and caught her mother in her strong young arms, kissing her roundly, her eyes shining, her cheeks flushed in the excitement of the hour, the additional excitement of the presence of these young men. She must kiss someone. Yes, the rumors were true, and more than true. The young school teacher could well carry her title as the belle of old Liberty Town here on the far frontier. A lovely lass of 18 years or so she was, blue of eye and of abundant red-brown hair of that tint which ever has turned the eyes and heads of men. Her mouth, smiling to show white, even teeth, was wide enough for comfort in a kiss, and turned up strongly at the corners, so that her face seemed always sunny and carefree, were it not for the recurrent grave, almost somber look of the wide-set eyes in moments of repose. Above the middle height of woman's stature, she had none of the lank irregularity of the typical frontier woman of the early age-lands, but was round and well-developed. Above the open collar of her brown riding costume stood the flawless column of a fair and tall white throat, new ripened into womanhood, wholly fit for love, gay of youth and its racing veins. What wonder Molly Wingate could have chosen not from two, but 20 suitors of the best in all that countryside? Her conquests had been many since the time when, as a young girl, and fulfilling her parents' desire to educate their daughter, she had come all the way from the Sangamon country of Illinois to the best school then existent so far west, Clay Seminary of quaint old Liberty. The touch of dignity gained of the ancient traditions of the South, never lost in 2 generations west of the Appalachians, remained about the young girl now, so that she rather might have classed above her parents. They, moving from Kentucky into Indiana, from Indiana into Illinois, and now on to Oregon, never in all their toiling days had forgotten their reverence for the gentlemen and ladies who once were their ancestors east of the Blue Ridge. They valued education, felt that it belonged to them, at least through their children. Education, betterment, progress, advance, those things perhaps lay in the vague ambitions of twice 200 men who now lay in camp at the border of our unknown empire. They were all Americans, 2nd, 3rd, 4th generation Americans. Wild, uncouth, rude, unlettered, many or most of them. Nonetheless, there stood among them now and again some tall flower of that culture for which they ever hungered, for which they fought, for which they now adventured yet again. Surely American also were these 2 young men whose eyes now unconsciously followed Molly Wingate in hot craving even of a morning thus far breakfastless, for the young leader had ordered his wagons on to the rendezvous before crack of day. Of the 2, young Woodhull, planter and man of means, mentioned by Molly's mother as open suitor, himself at first sight had not seemed so ill a figure either. Tall, sinewy, well clad for the place and day, even more foppish than Banyan in boot and glove, he would have passed well among the damsels of any courthouse day. The saddle and bridle of his mount also were a trace to the elegant, and the horse itself, a classy chestnut that showed bluegrass blood, even then had cost a pretty penny somewhere, that was sure. Sam Woodhull, now moving with a half-dozen wagons of his own out to Oregon, was reputed well-to-do, reputed also to be well-skilled at cards, at weapons, and at women. Townsmen accorded him first place with Molly Wingate, the beauty from east of the river, until Will Banyan came back from the wars. Since then had been another manner of war, that as ancient as male and female. That Banyan had known Woodhull in the field in Mexico, he already had let slip. What had been the cause of his sudden pulling up of his starting tongue? Would he have spoken too much of that acquaintance? Perhaps a closer look at the loose lips, the high cheeks, the narrow, close-set eyes of young Woodhull, his rather assertive air, his slight, indefinable swagger, his slouch in standing, might have confirmed some skeptic disposed to analysis who would have guessed him less than strong of soul and character. For the most part, such skeptics lacked. By this time the last belated unit of the Oregon caravan was at hand. The feature of the dusty drivers could be seen. Unlike Wingate, the newly chosen master of the train, who had horses and mules about him, the young leader, Banyan, captained only ox teams. They came now, slow-footed, steady, low-headed, irresistible, indomitable, the same locomotive power that carried the hordes of Asia into Eastern Europe long ago. And as in the days of that invasion the conquerors carried their households, their flocks and herds with them, so now did these half-savage Saxon folk have with them their all. Lean boys, brown, barefooted girls flanked the trail with driven stock. Chickens clucked in coops at wagon side. Uncounted children thrust out tousled heads from the openings of the canvas covers. Dogs beneath, jostling the tar buckets, barked in hostile salutation. Women in slatted sunbonnets turned impassive gaze from the high front seats, back of which, swung to the bows by leather loops, hung the inevitable family rifle in each wagon, and now, at the tailgate of every wagon, lashed fast for its last long journey, hung also the family plow. It was 48, and the grass was up. On to Oregon. The ark of our covenant with progress was passing out. Almost it might have been said to have held every living thing, like that other ark of old. Banyan hastened to one side, where a grassy level beyond the little stream still offered stance. He raised a hand in gesture to the right. A sudden note of command came into his voice, lingering from late military days. By the right and left flank, wheel, march. With obvious training, the wagons broke apart, alternating right and left, until two long columns were formed. Each of these advanced, curving out, then drawing in, until a long ellipse, closed at front and rear, was formed methodically and without break or flaw. It was the barricade of the plains, the moving fortresses of our soldiers of fortune, going west, across the plains, across the Rockies, across the deserts that lay beyond. They did not know all these dangers, but they thus were ready for any that might come. "Look, Mother!" Molly Wingate pointed with kindling eye to the wagon maneuver. "We trained them all day yesterday, and long before. Perfect." Her gaze mayhap sought the tall figure of the young commander, chosen by older men above his fellow townsman, Sam Woodhull, as captain of the Liberty train. But he now had other duties in his own wagon group. Ceased now the straining creak of gear and came rattle of yokes as the pins were loosed. Cattle guards appeared and drove the work animals apart to graze. Women clambered down from wagon seats. Sober-faced children gathered their little arms full of wood for the belated breakfast fires. Boys came down for water at the stream. The westbound paused at the Missouri, as once they had paused at the Don. A voice arose, of some young man back among the wagons busy at his work, paraphrasing an antebellum air. "Oh, then, Susanna, don't you cry for me. I'm going out to Oregon, with my banjo on my knee." Chapter 2, The Edge of the World. More than 2,000 men, women, and children waited on the Missouri for the green fully to tinge the grasses of the prairies farther west. The waning town of Independence had quadrupled its population in 30 days. Boats discharged their customary western cargo at the newer landing on the river, not far above that town. But it all was not enough. Men of upper Missouri and lower Iowa had driven in herds of oxen, horses, mules. But there were not enough of these. Rumors came that 100 wagons would take the Platte this year via the Council Bluffs, higher up the Missouri. Others would join on from St. Joe and Leavenworth. March had come when the wild turkey gobbled and strutted resplendent in the forest lands. April had passed, and the wild fowl had gone north. May and the upland plovers now were nesting all across the prairies. But daily had more wagons come, and neighbors had waited for neighbors, tardy at the great rendezvous. The encampment, scattered up and down the riverfront, had become more and more congested. Men began to know one another. Families became acquainted. The gradual sifting and shifting in social values began. Knots and groups began to talk of some sort of accepted government for the common good. They now were at the edge of the law. Organized society did not exist this side of the Provisional Government of Oregon, devised as a modus vivendi during the joint occupancy of that vast region with Great Britain. An arrangement terminated not longer than 2 years before. There must be some sort of law and leadership between the Missouri and the Columbia. Amid much bickering of petty politics, Jesse Wingate had some 4 days ago been chosen for the thankless task of train captain. Though that office had small authority and less means of enforcing its commands, nonetheless the train leader must be a man of courage, resource, and decision. Those of the earlier arrivals who passed by his well-organized camp of 40-odd wagons from the Sangamon country of Illinois said that Wingate seemed to know the business of the trail. His affairs ran smoothly. He was well-equipped and seemed a man of means. Some said he had 3,000 in gold at the bottom of his cargo. Moreover, and this appeared important among the northern element, at that time predominant in the rendezvous, he was not a Calhoun Secesh, or even a Benton Democrat, but an out-and-out, anti-slavery, free soil man. And the Provisional Constitution of Oregon, devised by thinking men of 2 great nations, had said that Oregon should be free soil forever. Already there were mutterings in 1848 of the coming conflict which a certain lank young lawyer of Springfield in the Sangamon country, Lincoln, his name was, 2 years ago among his personal friends had predicted as inevitable. In a personnel made up of bold souls from both sides the Ohio, politics could not be avoided even on the trail, nor were these men the sort to avoid politics. Sometimes at their campfire, after the caravan election, Wingate and his wife, their son Jed, would compare notes, in a day when personal politics and national geography meant more than they do today. "Listen, son," Wingate one time concluded. "All that talk of a railroad across this country to Oregon is silly, of course. But it's all going to be one country. The talk is that the treaty with Mexico must give us a slice of land from Texas to the Pacific, and a big one. All of it was taken for the sake of slavery. Not so Oregon. That's free forever. This talk of splitting this country, north and south, don't go with me. The Alleghanies didn't divide it. Burr couldn't divide it. The Mississippi hasn't divided it, or the Missouri, so rest assured the Ohio can't. No, nor the Rockies can't. A railroad? No, of course not. But all the same, a practical wagon road from free soil to free soil, I reckon that was my platform like enough. It made me captain. No, 'twasn't that, Jesse, said his wife. That ain't what put you in for train captain. It was your blamed impatience. Some of them lower Iowa men, them that first nominated you in the train meeting, town meeting, what you call it. They seen where you'd been plowing along here just to keep your hand in. One of them says to me, "Plowing, hey? Can't wait." "Well, that's what we're going out for, ain't it? To plow," says he. "That's the clean quill," says he. "So they 'lected you, Jesse. And the Lord have mercy on your soul." Now the arrival of so large a new contingent as this of the Liberty train under young Banyan made some sort of post-election ratification necessary, so that Wingate felt it incumbent to call the head men of the late comers into consultation if for no better than reasons of courtesy. He dispatched his son Jed to the Banyan Park to ask the attendance of Banyan, Woodhull, and such of his associates as he liked to bring at any suiting hour. Word came back that the Liberty men would join the Wingate conference around 11 of that morning, at which time the hour of the jump-off could be set. Chapter 3. The Rendezvous. As to the start of the great wagon train, little time indeed remained. For days, in some instances for weeks, the units of the train had lain here on the border, and the men were growing restless. Some had come 1,000 miles, and now were keen to start out for more than 2,000 miles additional. The grass was up. The men from Illinois, Indiana, Ohio, Iowa, Missouri, Kentucky, Arkansas, fretted on the leash. All along the crooked river front, on both sides from Independence to the river landing at Westport, the great spring caravan lay encamped, or housed in town. Now, on the last days of the rendezvous, a sort of hysteria seized the multitude. The sound of rifle fire was like that of a battle. Every man was sighting in his rifle. Singing and shouting went on everywhere. Someone fresh from the Mexican War had brought a drum, another a bugle. Without instructions, these began to sound their summons and continued all day long, at such times as the performers could spare from drink. The Indians of the friendly tribes, Otos, Kaws, Osages, come in to trade, looked on in wonder at the revelings of the whites. The straggling street of each of the nearby river towns was full of massed wagons. The treble line of white tops, end to end, lay like a vast serpent, curving, ahead to the west. Rivalry for the head of the column began. The sounds of the bugle set 1,000 uncoordinated wheels spasmodically in motion. Organization, system, were as yet unknown in this rude and dominant democracy. Need was therefore for this final meeting in the interest of law, order, and authority. Already some wagons had broken camp and moved on out into the main traveled road, which lay plain enough on westward, among the groves and glades of the valley of the Kaw. Each man wanted to be first to Oregon. No man wished to take the dust of his neighbor's wagon. Wingate brought up all these matters at the train meeting of some 60 men, which assembled under the trees of his own encampment at 11 of the last morning. Most of the men he knew. Banyan unobtrusively took a seat well to the rear of those who squatted on their heels or lolled full length on the grass. After the fashion of the immemorial American town meeting, the beginning of all our government, Wingate called the meeting to order and stated its purposes. He then set forth his own ideas of the best manner for handling the trail work. His plan, as he explained, was one long earlier perfected in the convoys of the old Santa Fe Trail. The wagons were to travel in close order. 4 parallel columns, separated by not too great spaces, were to be maintained as much as possible, more especially toward nightfall. Of these, the outer 2 were to draw in together when camp was made, the other 2 to angle out, wagon lapping wagon, front and rear, thus making an oblong corral of the wagons, into which, through a gap, the work oxen were to be driven every night after they had fed. The tents and fires were to be outside of the corral unless in case of an Indian alarm, when the corral would represent a fortress. The transport animals were to be hobbled each night. A guard, posted entirely around the corral and camp, was to be put out each night. Each man and each boy above 14 was to be subject to guard duty, under the ancient common law of the plains, and from this duty no man might hope excuse unless actually too ill to walk, nor could any man offer to procure any substitute for himself. The watches were to be set as 8, each to stand guard 1/4 part of alternate nights, so that each man would get every other night undisturbed. There were to be lieutenants, 1 for each of the 4 parallel divisions of the train. Also 8 sergeants of the guard, each of whom was to select and handle the men of the watch under him. No wagon might change its own place in the train after the start, dust or no dust. When Wingate ended his exposition and looked around for approval, it was obvious that many of these regulations met with disfavor at the start. The democracy of the train was one in which each man wanted his own way. Leaning head to head, speaking low, men grumbled at all this fuss and feathers and army stuff. Some of these were friends and backers in the late election. Nettled by their silence, or by their murmured comments, Wingate arose again. "Well, you have heard my plan, men," said he. "The Santa Fe men worked it up and used it for years, as you all know. They always got through. If there's anyone here knows a better way, and one that's got more experience back of it, I'd like to have him get up and say so." Silence for a time greeted this also. The northern men, Wingate's partisans, looked uncomfortably one to the other. It was young Woodhull, of the Liberty contingent, who rose at length. "What Captain Wingate has said sounds all right to me," said he. "He's a new friend of mine. I never saw him till 2-3 hours ago, but I know about him. What he says about the Santa Fe fashion I know for true. As some of you know, I was out that way, up the Arkansas, with Donovan for the Stars and Stripes. Talk about wagon travel. You got to have a regular system or you have everything in a mess. This here, now, is a lot like so many volunteers enlisting for war. There's always a sort of preliminary election of officers, sort of shaking down and shaping up. I wasn't here when Captain Wingate was elected. Our wagons were some late. But speaking for our men, I'd move to ratify his choosing, and that means to ratify his regulations. I'm wondering if I don't get a second for that." Some of the bewhiskered men who sat about him stirred, but cast their eyes toward their own captain, young Banyan, whose function as their spokesman had thus been usurped by his defeated rival, Woodhull. Perhaps few of them suspected the argumentum ad hominem, or rather ad feminam, in Woodhull's speech. Banyan alone knew this favor currying when he saw it, and knew well enough the real reason. It was Molly. Rivals indeed they were, these two, and in more ways than one. But Banyan held his peace until one quiet father of a family spoke up. "I reckon our own train captain, that we elected in case we didn't throw in with the big train, had ought to say what he thinks about it all." Will Banyan now rose composedly and bowed to the leader. "I'm glad to second Mr. Woodhull's motion to throw our vote and our train for Captain Wingate and the big train," said he. "We'll ratify his captaincy, won't we?" The nods of his associates now showed assent, and Wingate needed no more confirmation. "In general, too, I would ratify Captain Wingate's scheme. But might I make a few suggestions?" "Surely, go on." Wingate half rose. "Well then, I'd like to point out that we've got twice as far to go as the Santa Fe traders, and over a very different country. More dangerous, less known, harder to travel. We've many times more wagons than any Santa Fe train ever had, and we've hundreds of loose cattle along. That means a sweeping off of the grass at every stop, and grass we've got to have or the train stops. Besides our own call on grass, I know there'll be 5,000 Mormons at least on the trail ahead of us this spring. They've crossed the river from here to the bluffs, and they're out on the Platte right now. We take what grass they leave us. What I'm trying to get at, Captain, is this. We might have to break into smaller detachments now and again. We could not possibly always keep alignment in 4 columns. And then we'd be open to any Indian attack," interrupted Woodhull. "We might have to fight some of the time, yes," rejoined Banyan, "but we'll have to travel all the time, and we'll have to graze our stock all the time. On that one basic condition our safety rests, grass and plenty of it. We're on a long journey. You see, gentlemen," he added, smiling, "I was with Donovan also. We learned a good many things. For instance, I'd rather see each horse on a 30-foot picket rope, anchored safe each night, than to trust to any hobbles. A homesick horse can travel miles, hobbled in a night. Horses are a lot of trouble. Now I see that about a fourth of our people, including Captain Wingate, have horses and mules and not ox transport. I wish they all could trade for oxen before they start. Oxen last longer and fare better. They are easier to herd. They can be used for food in the hard first year out in Oregon. The Indians don't steal oxen. They like buffalo better. But they'll take any chance to run off horses or even mules. If they do, that means your women and children are on foot. You know the story of the Donner Party 2 years ago. On foot, in the snow. They died, and worse than died, just this side of California. Men of Iowa, of Illinois, Ohio, Indiana, began to nod to one another, approving the words of this young man. "He talks sense," said a voice aloud. "Well, I'm talking a whole lot, I know," said Banyan gravely. "But this is the time and place for our talking. I'm for throwing in with the Wingate train, as I've said. But will Captain Wingate let me add even just a few words more? For instance, I would suggest that we ought to have a record of all our personnel. Each man ought to be required to give his own name and late residence, and the names of all in his party. He should be obliged to show that his wagon is in good condition, with spare bolts, yokes, tires, bows and axles, and extra shoes for the stock. Each wagon ought to be required to carry anyhow half a side of rawhide, and the usual tools of the farm and the trail, as well as proper weapons and abundance of ammunition. No man ought to be allowed to start with this caravan with less supplies, for each mouth of his wagon, than 100 pounds of flour. 150 or even 200 would be much better. There is loss and shrinkage. At least half as much of bacon, 20 pounds of coffee, 50 of sugar would not be too much in my own belief. About double the pro rata of the Santa Fe caravans is little enough, and those whose transport power will let them carry more supplies ought to start full loaded, for no man can tell the actual duration of this journey, or what food may be needed before we get across. One may have to help another. Even Wingate joined in the outspoken approval of this, and Banyan, encouraged, went on. "Some other things, men, since you have asked each man to speak freely. We're not hunters, but homemakers. Each family, I suppose, has a plow and seed for the first crop. We ought, too, to find out all our blacksmiths, for I promise you we'll need them. We ought to have a half-dozen forges and as many anvils, and a lot of irons for the wagons. I suppose, too, you've located all your doctors, also all your preachers. You needn't camp them all together. Personally, I believe in Sunday rest and Sunday services. We're taking church and state and home and law along with us, day by day, men, and we're not just trappers and adventurers. The fur trade's gone. I even think we ought to find out our musicians. It's good to have a bugler if you can. And at night, when the people are tired and disheartened, music is good to help them pull together." The bearded men who listened nodded yet again. "About schools now, the other trains that went out, the Applegates in 1843, the Donners of 1846, each train, I believe, had regular schools along, with hours each day. Do you think I'm right about all this? I'm sure I don't want Captain Wingate to be offended. I'm not dividing his power. I'm only trying to stiffen it." Woodhull arose, a sneer on his face, but a hand pushed him down. A tall Missourian stood before him. "Right ye air, Will," said he. "Ye've an old head, and we can trust Hit. Ef Hit wasn't Captain Wingate is more older than you, and already done elected, I'd be for choosing ye for cap'n o' this here Hull train right now. Seein' Hit's the way Hit is, I move we vote to do what Will Banyan has said is fittin'. And I move we uns throw in with the big train, with Jess Wingate for cap'n. And I move we allow one more day to get in supplies and fixin's and trade hosses and mules and oxens, and then we start day atter tomorrow mornin' when the bugle blows. Then hooray for Oregon." There were cheers and a general rising, as though after finished business, which greeted this. Jesse Wingate, somewhat crestfallen and chagrined over the forward ways of this young man, of whom he never had heard till that very morning, put a perfunctory motion or so, asked loyalty and allegiance, and so forth. But what they remembered was that he appointed as his wagon column captains Sam Woodhull of Missouri, Caleb Price, an Ohio man of substance, Simon Hall, an Indiana merchant, and a farmer by name of Kelsey, from Kentucky. To Will Banyan, the trainmaster assigned the most difficult and thankless task of the train, the captaincy of the cow column. That is to say, the leadership of the boys and men whose families were obliged to drive the loose stock of the train. There were sullen mutterings over this in the Liberty column. Men whispered they would not follow Woodhull. As for Banyan, he made no complaint, but smiled and shook hands with Wingate and all his lieutenants, and declared his own loyalty and that of his men. Then left for his own little adventure of a half-dozen wagons, which he was freighting out to Laramie. Bacon, flour, and sugar for the most part. Each wagon driven by a neighbor or a neighbor's son. Among these already arose open murmurs of discontent over the way their own contingent had been treated. Banyan had to mend a potential split before the first wheel had rolled westward up the cow. The men of the meeting passed back among their neighbors and families, and spoke with more seriousness than hitherto. The rifle firing ended, the hilarity lessened that afternoon. In the old times, the keelboatmen bound west started out singing. The pack-train men of the fur trade went shouting and shooting, and the confident hilarity of the Santa Fe wagon caravans was a proverb. But now, here in the great Oregon train, matters were quite otherwise. There were women and children along. An unsmiling gravity marked them all. When the dusky velvet of the prairie night settled on almost the last day of the rendezvous, it brought a general feeling of anxiety, dread, uneasiness, fear. Now, indeed, and at last, all these realized what was the thing that they had undertaken. To add yet more to the natural apprehensions of men and women embarking on so stupendous an adventure, all manner of rumors now continually passed from one company to another. It was said that 5,000 Mormons, armed to the teeth, had crossed the river at St. Joseph and were lying in wait on the Platte, determined to take revenge for the persecutions they had suffered in Missouri and Illinois. Another story said that the Kaw Indians, hitherto friendly, had banded together for robbery, and were only waiting for the train to appear. A still more popular story had it that a party of several Englishmen had hurried ahead on the trail to excite all the savages to waylay and destroy the caravans, thus to wreak the vengeance of England upon the Yankees for the loss of Oregon. Much unrest arose over reports, hard to trace, to the effect that it was all a mistake about Oregon. That in reality, it was a truly horrible country, unfit for human occupancy, and sure to prove the grave of any lucky enough to survive the horrors of the trail, which never yet had been truthfully reported. Some returned travelers from the west beyond the Rockies, who were hanging about the landing at the river, made it all worse by relating what purported to be actual experiences. "If you ever get through to Oregon," they said, "you'll be 10 years older than you are now. Your hair will be white, but not by age." The Great Dipper showed clear and close that night, as if one might almost pick off by hand the familiar stars of the traveler's constellation. Overhead, countless brilliant points of lesser light enameled the night mantle, matching the many campfires of the great gathering. The wind blew soft and low. Night on the prairie is always solemn, and tonight the tense anxiety, the strained anticipation of more than 2,000 souls, invoked a brooding melancholy, which it seemed even the stars must feel. A dog, ominous, lifted his voice in a long, mournful howl, which made mothers put out their hands to their babes. In answer, a coyote in the grass raised a high, quavering cry, wild and desolate, the voice of the far west. This concludes the first part of 12 total of The Covered Wagon by Emerson Hough, produced by Best Audiobooks for free.